Spring, 1945. The war in Europe is ending. Cities lie in ruins. Millions are displaced. Soldiers return home. But not everyone makes it back. In the chaos of northern Italy, something strange begins to happen. Young German women start disappearing. Not in battle, not in bombings. They simply vanish. No bodies, no witnesses, just silence. These weren't soldiers. They were clerks, nurses, telegraph operators. Girls far from home, caught on the wrong side of history. The Italians called it justice. The Germans called it murder. But the truth? The truth was something nobody wanted to talk about. What really happened to these lost girls in the spring of 1945? To understand their fate, we must go back to when Italy and Germany were allies, when Mussolini and Hitler stood side by side. During those years, thousands of German personnel were stationed across Italy. Many were young women. They worked in offices. They operated radios. They typed reports and processed documents. They weren't fighters, but they wore the uniform. They represented the occupier. And when the alliance crumbled in 1943, everything changed. Italy switched sides. German forces became the enemy overnight. These girls found themselves trapped in a country that now hated them. Their world had turned upside down, and their nightmare was just beginning. September 1943. Italy surrenders to the Allies. But Germany doesn't accept this betrayal. Hitler sends troops flooding south. They occupy the northern half of Italy by force. The Italian Social Republic is born, a puppet state controlled from Berlin. Mussolini is reinstalled, but he's a shadow of his former self. Real power belongs to the Germans now, and scattered among the Wehrmacht divisions are those support staff, the secretaries, the communications specialists, young women doing their duty, unaware of what's coming. They work in requisitioned villas and commandeered hotels. They type in the morning, attend dances at night. For them, the war still feels distant, manageable. They have no idea what April will bring. But in the valleys and mountains, something else is growing. The Italian resistance. Partisans, they're called. Communists, monarchists, Republicans, Catholics, they agree on only one thing. The Germans must go. They sabotage supply lines. They ambush convoys. They execute collaborators in town squares. The violence is brutal on both sides. The Germans respond with massacres. Entire villages burned, hostages shot. It's a cycle of blood that feeds itself. And in this cauldron of hatred, those German girls become symbols. They're not seen as clerks or typists anymore. They're the face of the occupation, the visible enemy, vulnerable, alone, and increasingly, they're targets. By early 1945, the end is obvious to everyone. The Allies are pushing north. The German lines are collapsing. Supply chains have broken down. Communication is sporadic. Chaos spreads like a disease. German units begin retreating toward Austria and the Reich. It's every man for himself now. Orders are ignored. Discipline crumbles. And in this disintegration, those non-combat personnel are forgotten. There's no transport for them, no evacuation plan. Many are simply told to find their own way home. Imagine that, a 20-year-old girl from Bavaria, alone in hostile territory, hundreds of miles from safety, no money, no papers, speaking limited Italian. What would you do? Where would you go? Some tried to blend in. They discarded their uniforms, stole civilian clothes, attempted to disappear into the refugee columns clogging every road. Others sought protection from Allied troops, hoping British or American soldiers would treat them as prisoners of war. A few remained at their posts until the very end, loyal or perhaps just paralyzed by fear. But for many, April brought something worse than capture. It brought the partisans. After years of living in forests and fighting from the shadows, the resistance fighters were emerging into the light. They were taking control of towns before the Allies arrived, and they were settling scores, old grudges, fresh wounds. The accounts had to be balanced.
The killings began in the countryside. Isolated incidents at first. A body found in a ditch outside Verona, another near Lake Como, then more. Always young, always female, always German. The partisans didn't advertise what they were doing. There were no trials, no announcements. People simply disappeared. In the village of Belluno, 3 German secretaries vanished in a single night. Their office was found empty the next morning, coffee still warm on the desks. In Trento, witnesses reported seeing a group of women marched into the woods by armed men. Gunshots echoed from the trees. No one investigated. No one dared. This was the rough justice of liberation. Swift, final, unrecorded. But why target these women specifically? They weren't soldiers. They hadn't committed war crimes. Most had never fired a weapon. To understand, you must understand what Italy had endured. Years of occupation, years of fear and hunger, families torn apart, sons shot as hostages, daughters taken for forced labor. Every German uniform represented that suffering. Gender didn't matter. Age didn't matter. They were all guilty by association. And there was something else, something darker. Some of these women had formed relationships with German soldiers. Some had children by them. In the eyes of many Italians, this was collaboration, betrayal. And betrayal, in those days, carried only one sentence: death. The sexual dimension made everything worse. During the occupation, some Italian women had relationships with German soldiers too, willingly or otherwise. After liberation, these women faced brutal punishment. Their heads were shaved in public squares. They were stripped, beaten, paraded through streets while crowds spat and jeered. Some were killed outright. The German girls could expect no better, perhaps worse. They represented the conqueror, the foreigner, the other. And in the toxic atmosphere of April 1945, reason had no place. Mercy had no place. Only rage remained. The kind of rage that burns away everything human. The kind that turns ordinary men into executioners.
Take the case of Hildegard Müller. She was 23, from Stuttgart, working as a radio operator in Bolzano. When the retreat began, her unit left without her. Equipment failure, they said. They'd send transport back. They never did. Hildegard waited 3 days. Then she started walking north toward the Brenner Pass, hoping to reach Austria. She was found 2 weeks later in a shallow grave near Murano, a bullet through the back of her head. Her hands had been bound with wire. There was no investigation, no record, just another unmarked grave among thousands. Her family spent decades searching. They never learned what happened, never recovered her body. She simply ceased to exist. Or consider what happened in Milan. The great northern city, Mussolini's stronghold, fell to partisans on April 25th. The dictator himself was captured fleeing toward Switzerland. He was executed the next day, his body strung up in Piazza Loreto alongside his mistress and several officials. Crowds gathered to stone the corpses, to spit on them, to kick them. It was catharsis through violence. And in that atmosphere, being German was incredibly dangerous. Reports suggest dozens of German women were seized in Milan during those first days of liberation. Some were imprisoned, some were assaulted, others simply vanished. The partisan command kept no records. Allied authorities, arriving later, found mass confusion and no desire to investigate. The Allies were in a difficult position. They were liberating Italy, yes, but they needed Italian cooperation. The partisan movement was powerful, armed, and politically radical. Many were communists who might oppose Western interests after the war. Antagonizing them over the fate of German personnel wasn't a priority. Besides, the Allies had their own problems. Millions of displaced persons to process, war criminals to hunt, a shattered continent to rebuild. A few dozen missing German girls barely registered. Some British and American officers did file reports about atrocities against German prisoners. These documents exist in archives today. They describe beatings, summary executions, sexual violence, but they were marked low priority, filed away, forgotten. The girls remain lost.
How many died? We'll never know the exact number. Estimates vary wildly. Some historians say dozens, others suggest hundreds. The chaos of that period makes certainty impossible. Many weren't officially recorded as being in Italy to begin with. Records were destroyed as units retreated. Personnel lists were burned, and those who might have reported them missing, their families back in Germany, had their own crisis to survive. Germany itself was a ruin, cities flattened, the government collapsed, millions dead or missing. One more lost daughter was just another tragedy in an ocean of them. The searches, when they came too late. Yet some survived. A few German women made it through the chaos to tell their stories. Maria Schneider was one. A clerk attached to a supply depot in Verona, she disguised herself as an Austrian refugee when her unit evacuated. She spoke some Italian, enough to get by. For 3 weeks, she moved north on foot, sleeping in barns, stealing food from fields. Twice, she was stopped by partisans. The first time, she convinced them she was Slovenian. The second time, an older partisan recognized her accent as German. He raised his rifle. Then he lowered it. "Go," he said simply, "before I change my mind." She reached Austria in May. She never spoke publicly about what she'd seen. Another survivor, whose name was kept anonymous in post-war interviews, described a different horror. She and 5 other German women were captured by partisans near Brescia in late April. They were held in a farmhouse for 3 days. They could hear executions outside, prisoners being shot. They were certain their turn would come. But on the 3rd night, British troops arrived and took control. The partisans withdrew. The women were placed in a POW camp, treated, officially at least, according to Geneva Conventions. She later said the British soldiers probably saved their lives, but she also said this: "We were the lucky ones. Most girls weren't lucky." Her voice, recorded decades later, still trembled. The psychological toll on survivors was immense. They returned to a Germany that didn't want to hear their stories. The nation was confronting its own crimes, its own guilt. Tales of German suffering had no place in that reckoning. These women were told to be quiet, to move on. Some married quickly, eager for normalcy. Others never recovered. Depression, nightmares, what we'd now call PTSD. One woman, interviewed in the 1970s, said she still couldn't sleep with the lights off. She still saw the faces of the partisans who'd killed her friend while she hid in a cellar. "We were just girls," she said. "We didn't start the war. We didn't choose to be there, but we paid the price anyway."
The official silence lasted decades. West Germany, rebuilding and seeking acceptance in Europe, didn't want to discuss German victims. It complicated the narrative. Italy, integrating the partisan movement into its founding myth, didn't want to admit its heroes might have committed atrocities. The Cold War made everything more complicated. Many partisan leaders became communist politicians. Others joined the Italian government. They weren't going to incriminate themselves. Files remained sealed. Witnesses stayed silent. The story was buried. And the girls who died remained lost, not just in graves, but in history itself, as if they'd never existed at all, as if their deaths didn't matter. Perhaps that was the cruelest erasure of all. It wasn't until the 1980s that researchers began piecing the story together. German historians, interviewing elderly survivors, started documenting what had happened. They found fragmentary evidence, letters that ended abruptly, personnel records with ominous notes, whereabouts unknown. Italian local historians contributed too, finding oral testimonies in mountain villages, old men who remembered, women who'd heard stories. Slowly a picture emerged, not complete, never complete, but enough. Enough to confirm what had been whispered for 40 years, that in the spring of 1945, in the chaos of liberation, something terrible had happened, and nobody had wanted to talk about it. Nobody had wanted to remember, until it was almost too late.
One researcher, Klaus Hartmann, devoted years to the subject. He traveled across northern Italy in the 1990s, searching for graves. He interviewed partisan veterans, now in their 70s and 80s. Most refused to talk. A few admitted they'd seen things, done things. One old man told Hartmann about a farmhouse near Udine where 6 German women were shot in a single morning. He'd been there. He'd been young, caught up in the fury of the moment. Now, decades later, he wept describing it. They begged, he said. They were so young. But we were young too, and full of hate. We thought we were doing justice. Maybe we were just becoming like them. Hartmann recorded the interview. The old partisan died 2 months later. The moral questions are uncomfortable. These were German women, citizens of a regime responsible for unspeakable crimes. The Holocaust, the destruction of Europe, millions dead. Can we really call them innocent? They wore the uniform. They served the machine. Does that make them legitimate targets? Or were they, as they claimed, just young people trapped in circumstances beyond their control? These questions have no easy answers. War strips away the simple categories we use in peacetime. Right and wrong blur. Victim and perpetrator become confused. What's certain is this. Many of these women died terrified and alone, far from home, killed not for what they'd done, but for what they represented. Is that justice or just more violence? Consider the perspective of the partisans. For years they'd lived in constant danger. They'd seen friends tortured by the Gestapo, seen villages burned in reprisals, seen loved ones deported to camps. They'd endured cold, hunger, fear, and now, finally, they had the upper hand. The Germans were defeated, fleeing, vulnerable. The desire for revenge was overwhelming, understandable even. Does understanding it excuse it? That's for you to decide. But it's worth remembering that violence creates violence. Atrocity breeds atrocity. The cycle is hard to break. And in April 1945, in northern Italy, the cycle was spinning faster than ever. Nobody could control it anymore. Nobody really tried.
There's also the dimension of gender.
Why were women specifically targeted? Partly, as we've discussed, because relationships with occupiers were seen as betrayal. But there's something else. In war, violence against women often becomes symbolic. It's a way of humiliating the enemy, of demonstrating dominance, of destroying the future. Kill the women, and there are no more children, no continuation. It's a logic as old as war itself, and it's profoundly disturbing. These German girls became vessels for all the rage and pain their nation had caused. They paid with their bodies, their lives, for crimes they hadn't committed. Does their nationality make their suffering less worthy of acknowledgement? Less tragic? Many seem to have thought so. The post-war trials largely ignored this aspect. The Nuremberg tribunals focused on major war criminals, the German leadership, those who'd ordered the Holocaust and planned aggressive war. Smaller trials prosecuted concentration camp guards, SS officers, those directly involved in atrocities. But partisan actions against Germans in the chaos of 1945? That fell into a legal gray zone. The partisans were on the winning side. They'd been fighting a just cause, and the victims were German, which complicated sympathy. No one was prosecuted for killing German women in Italy in 1945. No trials, no justice. The deaths remained officially unacknowledged, the graves unmarked, the names unspoken, as if silence could somehow undo what had been done. Some families never stopped searching. They wrote letters to the Red Cross for decades. They contacted German veterans associations. They traveled to Italy themselves, showing photographs in village squares. Have you seen this girl? She was here in 1945. She never came home. Most got nowhere. But occasionally they found something. A local who'd remembered, a partisan who'd developed a conscience, a grave in a church cemetery with a simple marker. Unknown German woman, 1945. These discoveries brought some closure. Not peace, perhaps, but at least certainty. The not knowing is its own torture. Better a grave than an eternal question mark. Better grief than endless, aching hope.
In 2003, a German documentary team made a film about these lost girls. They interviewed survivors, now in their 80s. They showed photos of young women in uniform, smiling at the camera, girls who looked like anyone's daughter or sister. The film aired in Germany and caused a brief controversy. Some criticized it as revisionist, an attempt to portray Germans as victims when Germany was the aggressor. Others saw it as simply telling a forgotten truth. Human tragedy doesn't respect politics. Suffering doesn't care about ideology. The film ended with this question: how many stories remain untold? How much history have we buried? The screen faded to black. No answer was given. Perhaps there is none. Let's look at a specific location, Lake Como. Beautiful, serene, surrounded by mountains. Today it's a luxury destination. In April 1945, it was a killing ground. Mussolini was caught nearby, trying to flee to Switzerland. He was executed on the 28th, his body taken to Milan. But in the days before and after, the area saw numerous summary executions. Fascist officials, German soldiers, and those girls. Several bodies were reportedly dumped in the lake, weighted down with stones. Others were buried in the surrounding forests. A local priest kept a private diary. In it, he described finding 3 bodies near his church, young women shot multiple times. He buried them quietly in unconsecrated ground. He never reported it. Decades later, his diary was found. Why didn't he report it? Fear?
Certainly. The partisans were in control. Challenging them was dangerous. But also, perhaps a sense that it didn't matter. So many had died. What were three more? This is the banality of atrocity. Not dramatic evil, but exhausted acceptance. The priest probably wasn't a bad man. He was simply overwhelmed, broken by what he'd seen, unable to process more horror. So he buried the girls and moved on. He said prayers over them. That was all he could do, or all he thought he could do. His diary entry ends with this line, "God forgive us, we have become what we despised." It's one of the most haunting sentences in all the documentation from that period.
There's a broader context here, too. The end of World War II saw violence against women across Europe. German women raped by Soviet soldiers, French women accused of collaboration, Polish women caught between armies. War sexualizes violence and weaponizes gender. The Italian case isn't unique, it's part of a pattern. But that doesn't diminish it. Each victim deserves acknowledgement. Each death matters. The problem is scale. So many died. So many stories were lost. We focus on what we can document. The rest remains in darkness. And that darkness is vast. It contains multitudes. Millions of individual tragedies we'll never know. The lost German girls of Italy are just a fraction. But their story illuminates something important, something we need to remember. What is that lesson? Perhaps it's this: war doesn't end cleanly. The formal surrenders, the treaties, the ceremonies, these are just paper. The real war continues in hearts and minds, in the revenge killings and reprisals, in the silent suffering of survivors, in the families waiting for loved ones who'll never return. The war in Europe officially ended May 8, 1945, but for these girls, and thousands like them, the dying continued for weeks after. In the chaos, in the shadow of liberation, they fell through the cracks of history. And we, decades later, struggle even to count them, to name them, to acknowledge they existed. That's a failure we should recognize. Modern researchers use various methods to reconstruct what happened. They analyze German military records, cross-referencing personnel lists with repatriation records. They interviewed descendants of survivors. They use ground-penetrating radar to search for unmarked graves. In 2015, a team found a mass grave near Bolzano containing remains of several individuals from the 1945 period. DNA testing identified two as German women in their early 20s. Their families, located through genetic databases, finally got answers 70 years after their deaths. Closure, of a sort. But how many other graves remain unfound? How many bodies were destroyed, burned, or thrown into rivers? We'll never have a complete accounting. The past keeps its secrets.
It's important to note that not all partisans participated in these killings. Many opposed summary executions. Some actively protected German prisoners, including women. The Italian resistance wasn't a monolith. It contained communists and Catholics, workers and aristocrats, pragmatists and ideologues. Some units maintained strict discipline and treated prisoners humanely. Others were little more than armed gangs settling personal scores. In the chaos of April 1945, with no central authority, anything could happen, and did. The best and worst of humanity emerged simultaneously. That's the truth of war. It reveals us completely. The courage and the cruelty, the nobility and the horror, all mixed together, inseparable. There's a small memorial in the town of Merano in South Tyrol. It was erected in 2008 by a local historical society. a simple stone plaque in German and Italian. It reads, "In memory of all victims of war and violence, 1939-1945. May we never forget, may we never repeat." It doesn't specifically mention the German girls. That would be too controversial. But locals know. The plaque stands near where several bodies were found in the 1980s. Forensic analysis suggested young women shot at close range. They were reburied in the town cemetery. No names, no ages, just unknown. The memorial is rarely visited. Tourists don't know it exists, but a few people, mostly elderly, bring flowers occasionally. Remember quietly. Mourn privately. What did the Allies know and when? Declassified documents show American and British intelligence received reports of atrocities against Germans in April and May 1945. Some officers were troubled. Memos were written recommending investigations, but higher command had other priorities. The focus was on processing millions of POWs, establishing occupation zones, beginning denazification. Reports of German civilians or support staff being killed by partisans were acknowledged but not pursued. One memo shows a British colonel bluntly states, "While regrettable, these incidents must be seen in context of German crimes. Investigating would strain relations with partisan commands. Recommend no action." A cold calculus. Politically necessary, perhaps, but it condemned those victims to being forgotten.
There's a psychological term, worthy victims versus unworthy victims. It's harsh, but accurate. Some victims receive sympathy, memorials, justice. Others don't. The calculus depends on politics, timing, and narrative. In 1945, German victims weren't worthy. Germany was the aggressor, the architect of genocide. German suffering seemed trivial compared to the Holocaust, to the millions dead across Europe. This is understandable, but it's also incomplete. Suffering isn't a competition. A 20-year-old Earl shot in a forest dies just as dead whether her nation was aggressor or victim. Her pain is just as real, her family's grief just as sharp. Acknowledging that doesn't diminish other suffering. It doesn't excuse German crimes. It simply recognizes a fuller truth. Consider how memory works. Nations build narratives about their past. Italy's post-war identity was built on resistance. The partisans were heroes who fought fascism. This is true, but it's not the whole truth. Some partisans were heroes. Others were criminals. Most were complex human beings who did both noble and terrible things. But complexity doesn't make good national mythology. So the inconvenient parts get edited out. The summary executions, the revenge killings, the score settling. For decades, questioning the partisan movement in Italy was almost taboo. Only recently have Italian historians begun examining this darker side and facing resistance for it. Memory is political. Truth is often sacrificed for cohesion. Germany had its own memory problems. For decades, public discussion focused on German guilt. Rightly so. The Holocaust, the war of aggression, these crimes required acknowledgement. But this made discussing German suffering difficult. It felt like changing the subject, like deflecting responsibility. So Germans who'd experienced violence, like those women who survived Italy, often stayed silent. They didn't want to be seen as complainers or revisionists. Only in the 1990s, as the wartime generation began dying, did this start changing. Books appeared about German civilian casualties. Documentaries examined the bombing campaigns, the expulsions from Eastern Europe, and yes, the killings in Italy.
It became possible to hold two truths simultaneously. Germany caused immense suffering. Germans also suffered.
This nuance is crucial. Acknowledging that German women were killed in Italy doesn't excuse or diminish German crimes. The Holocaust remains the Holocaust. The war of aggression remains inexcusable. But historical completeness requires us to see everything, the full scope. The Germans in Italy in 1945 weren't decision makers. They weren't SS guards or Gestapo agents. They were support staff. Largely young, largely female, largely powerless. They served a criminal regime, yes, but their culpability was limited, and their deaths, often brutal, served no purpose. Not justice, not security, just revenge. Acknowledging that isn't revisionism, it's honesty. And history demands honesty, even when it's uncomfortable, especially when it's uncomfortable. What do we owe these lost girls now? They're long dead. Most have no known graves. Their families are mostly gone. What's the point of remembering? Perhaps this: every life matters. Every death deserves acknowledgement. Not to equate different kinds of suffering, but to recognize shared humanity. These girls had dreams, hopes, fears. They wrote letters home. They had favorite songs. They laughed with friends. They were people, not symbols. War turned them into symbols, and symbols are easy to kill. Easier than people. But they were people first. And when we forget that, when we let them disappear into historical footnotes, we lose something essential. We lose the specificity of suffering, the individual tragedy, and we make future tragedies easier. Today, you can walk through northern Italy and see no trace of what happened. The cities have been rebuilt. The forests are peaceful. The lakes are beautiful again. Time has erased the physical evidence, but the past remains just beneath the surface, in archives, in fading memories, in the occasional grave discovered during construction. History isn't past. It's always present. It shapes what we are. And choosing what to remember, what to forget, these aren't neutral acts. They're moral choices. By telling the story now, we're making a choice. To remember what was forgotten. To acknowledge what was denied. To give voice to the voiceless. It's late. 80 years late. But better late than never. Better to speak than to leave silence.
In the end, the story of the lost German girls of Italy is a story about war's aftermath, about how violence echoes, about how the victims multiply long after the fighting stops. It's about justice and revenge and how hard it is to tell them apart when emotions run high. It's about memory and politics and how truth often becomes a casualty of both. Most of all, it's a reminder that in war there are no clean hands. Everyone is stained, victors and vanquished alike. The Italian partisans fought for a just cause, but some committed injustice. The German girls served an evil regime, but most were not themselves evil. Life is more complex than the stories we tell, and these girls, lost in the spring of 1945, deserve to be remembered not as symbols, but as what they were: human beings who suffered and died far from home, in chaos not of their making. May their stories, finally told, rest them in peace.